day, everyone. So we are going to be talking about the promise of AI, and not just in theory, but also in practice. And I'm going to do a bit of a fly-in to what is AI more broadly, and what do we see happening in that space. And then Kirstin-Anne is going to be speaking very specifically about AI in healthcare. And you know, attempting a definition is always hard when it comes to AI. A famous computer scientist, Larry Tesler, claims that it's everything that hasn't been done before. More specifically, you could say it's when we give computers human-like abilities for cogniting functions. It's basically when they can do more than just follow simple commands written in code. We look at 5 different aspects of AI. They're not mutually exclusive. They actually overlap quite a bit. But basically, we look at robotics, natural language, machine learning, computer vision, and lately, virtual agents or virtual assistants to help us with perceiving, reasoning, learning, and problem solving. It's interesting to see how quickly this space is growing. It's not a very mature space yet, to be honest. And most of the investment, to no surprise, is actually done by the big companies, the big tech companies, the digital natives, the Google, Alibaba, Baidu, Salesforce, of course the car manufacturers, IBM, very well-known names. They account for about 18 to 27 billion US dollars in investments in AI in 2016. A very interesting segment of that is actually M&A, and that is not just to get the technology, it's actually to get the people as well, because real knowledge of AI is a very scarce resource. So these big companies make substantial investments into acquiring this competence to 2 to 3 billion last year. If you happen to be an entrepreneur in this segment, you would be making about 5 to 10 million for your personal knowledge from these kind of acquisitions. In addition, we're seeing much more investments from venture capital, private equity, and it is growing very, very quickly. But it's still a fragment of how much is invested in software, for example. So AI accounts for 1 to 3% of VCP investments, whereas software is 60%. So we're still talking about a small emerging field. So where is AI development happening? Where are the big technologies that are being developed? The most prominent one is machine learning. It's very, very natural within this deep learning. It's the most prominent one. It is because it is the fundamental building block of pretty much all the other technologies as well. And then you see a lot of investments in areas such as computer vision and natural language processing, which is also building blocks. Computer vision, very much part of the autonomous vehicles. Smart robotics need natural language processing, etc., etc. So 60% of investments into AI go into machine learning. And it has had an impact, there is no question about it. If we just look 5 years back, the ability to train and achieve more through deep learning, for example, has become 5 to 6 times quicker. Combined with a multitude of more data, it has actually meant that a field such as computer vision is now as accurate as a human in determining the information in pictures, and therefore very, very useful also in healthcare. However, a big problem for us sitting here in Finland, which is part of Europe, is that we are falling behind. And it is due to a number of factors. We have a AI readiness as defined by MGI, McKinsey Global Institute, which is far below the US. And the AI readiness is a combination of different factors, drivers, such as the capabilities, the investments, and the general level of adoption of digital. And in Europe, unfortunately, we are only getting about 10% of the global investments into AI. And that's not just because the big companies aren't here, it's also because we don't have as much talent here as we have in the US and in China. And because we haven't actually done the previous step on the ladder. So in Europe, we haven't digitized, we haven't involved digital technologies as well as the US has. So we are 33% less digital than the US in our industries and in our businesses. That's probably not true for Finland, but this is for Europe as a whole. Nevertheless, we have an amazing potential in healthcare. The AI impact in terms of value creation potential in billions of US dollars is about 400 billion US dollars. And it's right up there with transport and logistics. Obviously, everybody knows what Amazon is about to do. Also up there with automotive, retail's even more potential. And a lot of this is also for advanced analytics, for using the data, using the analytics in a very, very structural and value-creating way. So huge potential in healthcare. And it is because AI can really help us solve the most fundamental questions in healthcare, which is finding, preventing diseases. It's finding the right diagnosis, finding the right care, following up that care, and learning. So we can have help of AI in each of the most important aspects of healthcare. And it's not just on the quality of care, it's also on patient engagement, and it's also on operational efficiency. So it really brings everything together, and Kirstin-Anne is going to go further into details of what we can learn here. But we're not there yet. As I said before, healthcare is not an early adopter, just as Europe is not. We are clearly, as a sector, lagging behind, for example, financial services and high-tech and telecoms. What we see, the biggest bet in AI, as we saw it in the first picture, is made by the existing big companies. They are not in healthcare. So the huge investments in this space that's really driving the development is in sectors such as high-tech and in financial services. But unfortunately in healthcare, we are also not investing as much as we should in the next few years. So when we've asked thousands of leaders in this sector if they are going to spend more on the opportunities in AI in any of these areas or all of them, the answer is much less positive than in other segments, even though healthcare has a much bigger potential. And that's something that needs to change.
Great. Thanks very much, Pia. So there's a question of why are we not investing as much behind? Why are people not really getting behind this and saying it's going to be the revolution in healthcare that we've promised? And I think it's partly because revolutions in healthcare have been promised over many, many years and have tended to overpromise and underdeliver. And I think that comes back to the fact that actually we need to think very purposefully about how and where we deploy AI in healthcare and make sure that we focus as much on that implementation and the change management and the transformation that goes on alongside it as we do on the technology itself. I mean, I was very struck this morning, I'm not sure she's still in the audience, by Sally Yarvella's question about, she said, it's got to be the why. So why are we doing this? What problem are we trying to solve? And I am struck, so I've been working for the last 5 years with technology companies, many in AI, some in others, and there is frequently a disconnect between an amazing, brilliant technology and any form of problem that they're trying to solve, or how are they creating value for the health service. Now this, luckily this isn't a problem. There are plenty of areas of frustration and challenge where doctors, patients, payers alike can actually come around and say, we've got a real problem here that AI can help. But it's really about finding where those overlaps are and making sure that we follow all the way through from finding a technology to help to making the transformation in the care pathway or how we pay for care to actually reap the benefits. And once we start to see benefits flowing through, I think there'll be much more confidence in health system leaders to invest behind AI and other new technologies. So I thought what we might do is look at sort of 3 examples of where I do think there is a good overlap and match between the AI technology and healthcare needs, and therefore that there has been early progress in these areas, but then also use that to say some of these early lessons can also reveal some of the additional risks in terms of what we need to think about in deployment of AI. So the first one, which you may be familiar with, is Babylon in the UK. Now, in some ways, this is very similar to the example I saw on stage this morning from Mehelion. It is a technology which is a primary triage at the front of either an emergency care pathway visit or at the front of a GP. And I will show it to you in action in a minute. It provides a look at the patient's current symptoms, the patient's medical history, and a knowledge database. You will see how it then supports a doctor in making a diagnosis and supports a patient in understanding what treatment options might be preferable for them. Now, the interesting thing is, for 3.5, 4 years, Babylon tried to market this to GPs, to primary care physicians, with the story that, look, you are overworked, you've got too much, you want to expand your list sizes, you can't give the time to your patients. This will give you an opportunity to deal with a certain cohort of your patients in a different way. There was some adoption from some GPs, but there was also quite a lot of resistance, a lot of worry about the threat that this would bring to how practices worked. And it was a real struggle for them. The real value it created, actually, is we have a huge problem with access to primary care in the UK, particularly for working families, particularly for families with children, particularly out of hours. And it was when they worked with the NHS to find a way of making this service directly available to consumers that it really started to take off. And whether it's all provided by Babylon, it's not just this service that has taken off, but it's other digital primary care providers. And finally, all GPs started thinking, actually, this is something that will help. And this has caused a huge leap forward in terms of digital primary care in the UK, but it has also forced changes in regulation. So only last week, the UK has adjusted how it reimburses general practice to make sure that this kind of technology can both flourish but not penalise existing players. And so I think that's a really good example of actually you've got to match the technology to a real use and demand to get that uptake and impact. I think I'm going to show you a little bit of it in action because I think it's quite...
Hi Alexa, I want to speak to Babylon.
Hello Louise, how can I help you?
Well, I've been feeling a bit dizzy recently.
I'm sorry to hear that. Can you tell me a bit more? Do you feel like the room is spinning, or are you feeling faint?
Yeah, sometimes it feels like the room's spinning.
And have you noticed any hearing loss?
Yeah, I have actually.
Do you have a ringing, buzzing, or humming sound in one or both ears?
Yeah, both ears. It's horrible.
Do you have any pain in your ears?
No.
Have you had a fever?
No, none.
Have you noticed any discharge coming out of your ears?
No.
Looking at your user graph, I can see you had glandular fever a few months ago.
Oh yeah, that was awful.
For how long have you been unwell with these symptoms now?
A couple of months.
Finally, have you noticed that your ears are feeling full or blocked?
Yes, actually.
I think I might know what's been causing your symptoms. It is most likely to be Meniere's disease, a condition of the inner ear that can affect balance and hearing. It could also be labyrinthitis, an infection of the nerve in the ear. Meniere's disease needs a specialist opinion, and might be helped with some medicine to reduce the dizziness, so I'd recommend talking to one of our GPs.
Sure, sounds good.
Dr. Gartra is available straight away, and according to your calendar, so are you. Would you like me to book your appointment?
Yes, please.
All booked. Your phone will ring in just a minute, when the appointment starts.
So you've probably used similar services yourself. It does actually work quite like that in normal practice. I've used it myself. And you can see that that's a combination of natural language processing and that deep learning mechanism. I think the most interesting part of it, though, and you'll have seen it, is that percentages that changed and went up and down on the right-hand side. Now, the reason that's important is AI, like medical science, I was a doctor by my training, is not a certain science. You're not going to get an exact result at any point. And this in itself, when we're applying AI and deep learning to either diagnostics or recommending action courses, is a real problem. And what I mean by that is we have had in the UK, again, a system called Pathways, which means that and it's everybody who calls up for a non-urgent, non-ambulance appointment gets triaged by a non-clinical, much more hierarchical, traditional decision-making tree. Now that decision-making tree is very good. It's based on the best evidence globally. It's been very well validated. It comes up with good results. Yet it is forever criticized for being both over-conservative in how it questions and also over-conservative in its recommendations. It will tend to say, go see a doctor or go to A&E. And there is a good reason for that. I mean, it's very frustrating. I've experienced it. I had a 3-year-old 2 weeks ago who had difficulty breathing, and it was a reoccurrence of something. I was pretty convinced it was croup, but I had to go through this whole long questionnaire, which including ruling out the possibility that my 3-year-old had a deep vein thrombosis. And highly unlikely, but I went through a rigorous questionnaire about whether he'd been bedbound in bed for 3 weeks or so, and you as a patient wonder what's going on. But the problem is it's been taught to be more and more risk adverse, because as soon as a big machine like this gets exposed, if it doesn't recommend, it's not the power of the diagnosis that's the problem, it's where you set the threshold of risk. And if it's an individual clinician seeing a few patients, they're unlikely to experience the 0.001% of 3-year-olds who have a deep vein thrombosis or 4-year-olds who have a hip infection. But once you start to apply this at national level using big computers, that probability is going to come up. And how are we going to deal with that if it recommends a conservative treatment? And therefore, as health systems, we are going to have to start thinking, it's not insolvable, but where are we happy having risk in these algorithms? Where are we going to set the boundaries? And we are going to have to probably accept some level of mistakes to get the benefits. How are we going to handle those mistakes? How are we going to mitigate them? And how are we going to make sure that they are continually reduced by making sure we retrain the algorithms, check what they're recommending, follow up to make sure that actually even beyond the training data, they are playing out well in real life. And it's something that I think will become more and more prominent. We've seen a lot already today. I think another area where both demand for diagnostics is exceeding the ability to supply, particularly in screening, and we now have, as Pia was saying, real good visual technology. So there's a strong match in this area, I believe, between the use of AI technology and a real need, not in necessarily the complex cases where you want real not clinical knowledge of the case and multidisciplinary meetings to make a diagnosis, but in the routine screening, let's say, of mammograms or even chest x-rays on admission, etc. There's a real use for this technology, which clinicians welcome rather than feel is a threat. Robotics, this side of the page is divided into two. The left-hand side is much more what I call the back office functions of robotics: delivery of your bed linen, delivery of meals, transportation around the hospital, movement of beds, even going into some robotic process automation in your back offices, whether that's in processing finance data and claims or sending off reports to the National Data Center or managing HR sickness. And the right-hand side is robotics in health. And there are great examples of how robotics are leading to bigger outcomes in health. But what I tend to say to people is actually the stronger match actually between real demand and value creation is on the left-hand side in the back office. Now, I know that here in the Nordics you have a lot of this already in place. But there are systems within Europe, the UK, France, Germany, where actually they are thinking, when they talk about robotics, they start getting excited about the right-hand side without having done the back office, the left-hand side, where the risk, as we talked just about risk a minute ago, is much lower. There's very little clinical risk, and there is huge potential and much earlier savings to be realized. I think where this is going, if you want to think for hospitals that already have this over here, the question for me is then, are you using the data that is coming out of that to get much more advanced in terms of prediction, matching supply and demand, optimizing flow logistics, etc.? So I think if those three examples have hopefully thrown up two of the aspects of AI which I think are really important. One is matching AI with a purpose, or that why question. And the second is how you're managing risk and how you're thinking about the risk-benefit trade-offs of using artificial intelligence in any setting. The third challenge that we need to overcome and grapple with is data. I think it's been talked about a lot today by a number of people. VTT in its presentation, it was amazingly powerful to see that just gathering the data to do that trial on warfarin, because of the inaccessibility and the regulations, was going to take up to 9 months just to get the data flowing in. And that is something that will get better to a certain extent, but as lots of people have said, does need to be managed within the confines of the regulatory and sensitive data. But it is difficult data, and it isn't. And I think, as we see here, it's not just the raw CT image that you need to train these algorithms on. You need really high quality data in terms of, you need the image, but then you need it to be labeled, and then you need it to match it with the diagnosis and the history, and be able to pull all those data sets together in order to train and develop these algorithms. And again, as Pia alluded to actually in the last presentation with siloed data, probably 85% of the data that you really need so that actually AI and deep learning is contributing and giving us more than what we already have is not in our healthcare data sets, but for the patient, either in their behavioral, their social, their environments, the genetics. And it's not that that data is not out there, but who is going to create the platforms that are going to aggregate that? And as we as healthcare leaders start to think through the storage of data, healthcare records, interoperability, how are we recognizing that a lot of the data is sitting in non-traditional sources? And actually there's a real question about who the natural aggregators of that data will be. There's a lot of interest actually from the telecoms platforms and people like Apple actually that they maybe own a much larger proportion of this data, and it might be easier to go the other way of taking the medical health data and integrating back into their data sets than vice versa. So I think the final message is that there's actually a role to play for everybody here, so everybody in this room. Providers themselves have to be digitally enabled to start with. That is the foundation. And you need, I loved again the Meherline option of the future doctors. You need to have doctors and clinicians and nursing staff who are really excited about embracing the changes that it brings, and also are helping think through what data needs to be stored, what the problems are that could be solved with it. The tech providers are already starting to embrace the idea of common standards and the movement of data across, both so that they can get access to different data sets, but also that they still maintain relevant services, and that they are not taken over by someone else coming into their space, whether that's a Microsoft or an Amazon, who will take a totally different approach and disrupt the whole healthcare data industry. As I said, regulators, and it's not just regulators, but actually payers as well, need to think about what needs to be done to change how they incentivize this. The whole issue of consent. I was fascinated by the debate that is playing out here around how the National Health Archive is used and what it is used for and under what permissions that's been covered across the day. And payers, again, how are they reimbursing? As I said, we've just had to change the reimbursement model for primary care in the UK a little bit to incorporate different digital models of health. And often, actually, you won't get the move without that kind of incentive in place. So how are reimbursement structures, how are we moving to more capitated models that incentivize the use of these technologies? So everybody has a role to play, and it's an exciting future. I think I'd end with a message, but we really need to focus much more on use and purpose than the technology if it's going to have the revolution we want to. Thank you.